Hello, America. My name is Dylan John, and you are listening to Nature and the Nation. For today's episode, I will be looking at Thucydides on Justice, Power, and Human Nature, edited by Paul Woodruff. So Paul Woodruff provides an introduction, and he translates it, and he provides periodic notes. This is basically an abridgment of the Peloponnesian War by Thucydides. He boils it down to probably the most important speeches and narratives, the highlights, and the stuff that you should know. So it's a nice way to get the real gist of the Peloponnesian War, the best and most important parts of it, without having to read the whole thing. And it's interesting that the title that he chooses on Justice, Power, and Human Nature, because it's not a treatise on justice, power, and human nature. It's not intended to be. It's a history of the Peloponnesian War. But aspects of justice, power, and human nature are discussed in the speeches that Thucydides puts into the mouths of the characters, the politicians and generals and participants in the events that he's describing. And even just in his narration of certain events, he's not explicitly really talking about human nature. He's illustrating things about human nature through the narration of what happens. He's not telling you, he's showing you. And you can kind of draw your own conclusions about what that actually says about human nature. So that's kind of interesting to me. Like all my episodes, I'm going to read a couple sections. One of the sections I'm going to read is from the introduction by Paul Woodruff. It's not actually a writing by Thucydides, but it describes the basic framework, the various participants in the war. It gives us a bird's eye view of the Peloponnesian War so that we've got something we can work with going forward as we dig deeper into this book and into Thucydides in general. So he says, quote, "The principal differences between Sparta and Athens at the time of the war were these. The Spartans had an ancient constitution, of which they were very proud, which combined elements of monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy. Its stability was the envy of Greece. Athens, on the other hand, had been through more than a century of political upheavals and emerged with a spanking new democracy. Sparta, isolated in the center of the Peloponnesus, was a bastion of resistance to cultural change, while Athens welcomed all sorts of innovation and became a home to what is called the New Learning. This difference was further sharpened by a minor language barrier. The cities spoke different dialects of Greek. They were divided also along ethnic lines. As Ionians, the Athenians had very different customs and traditions from Dorians, such as the Spartans, Corinthians, and Syracusans. Sparta controlled its own fertile district, known as Laconia, as well as the conquered territory of Messenia. These made Sparta self-sufficient in terms of food. Athens, on the other hand, had too little farmland to support its large population, and had virtually no forests. It depended on commerce to supply food for its people and timber for its shipbuilding. Sparta was relatively poor in money, and was not enriched by the voluntary alliance that it led. Athens controlled rich silver mines, and some of its citizens owned gold mines in Thrace. It was a thriving commercial center, and to make it still richer, ruled an empire from which it collected payments. It was these that financed the Parthenon and the other grand buildings of the period. Sparta. Spartan government was much admired by conservatives all over the Greek world. Sparta ruled an agricultural domain worked by a conquered people, the Helots, who outnumbered the Spartans and were liable to rebel if Sparta showed any weakness. To meet this challenge, the Spartans developed a superb military machine and a system of government that was a model of stability. Military leadership was in the hands of 2 hereditary kings. The Spartan assembly was open to all citizens, but they did not all have the right to make speeches there. The Spartan Council of Elders consisted of the 2 kings and 28 well-born citizens who were elected for life. There were 5 officials, known as ephors or overseers, who were elected for 1-year terms by the assembly and whose duties included the judiciary. Citizenship was limited to free-born males who owned landed estates of a certain size. At the time of the war, there were fewer than 4,000 citizens of military age. Spartan armies were the most feared in all Greece, owing to their discipline and training. But Sparta depended heavily for manpower on her allies. Since the 6th century, Sparta had been developing a system of alliances known as the Peloponnesian League, with the mainly Dorian cities of the Peloponnesus. The Spartans did not collect payments from their allies as the Athenians did, but relied on them for direct military assistance and rewarded them by bolstering their traditional oligarchical governments against attempts by the people to seize power. Athens. The hallmark of democratic Athens was the freedom of its citizens, especially the freedom to speak their mind in the assembly, and the city vibrated with opportunities that scandalized such conservatives as Plato. The assembly in Athens was a legislative body open to all citizens, any of whom could address the assembly. Because the assembly could be swayed by any effective speaker, some men rose to power without winning elected office, the most famous example in our period being Cleon. Such men were called demagogues. There was also a council consisting of 500 citizens selected by lot, which prepared business for the assembly. The use of the lottery for the council and other offices presupposed the democratic principle that all citizens were qualified to assist in government. Generals, however, were elected and could have considerable influence. All officials faced formal scrutiny on leaving office, so that they could be punished for corruption or malfeasance while in office. The popular courts consisted of large panels of up to 501 judges, who were ordinary citizens who had shown up to collect their day's pay for court duty. Such a large panel, it was thought, could not be bribed or otherwise influenced unfairly. There was no judge or judiciary set above these panels, and their decisions were final. Pay for court duty meant that poor citizens could afford to take part. Power in Athens was held by the citizens, and policy shifted quickly to suit their wishes. By Greek standards, and by most standards in history, this was extreme democracy, even though citizenship was limited to adult males whose parents were citizens. Women, slaves, and a large population of resident aliens, called metics, were excluded. Readers who are inclined to scoff at this should consider that democracy in the United States was not more inclusive than this until well into the 19th century. In fact, citizenship was open to a much wider class in Athens than in Sparta. Rich or poor, if you could prove Athenian descent, you were a citizen of Athens. This, too, shocked the conservative. Day laborers, with no landed estate at all, could pass judgment on the richest men of the city. At the start of the war, there were more than 40,000 citizens in Athens, of whom 21,000 could afford to serve as the heavily armed infantry known as hoplites. Soldiers were required to buy their own equipment. Resident aliens could contribute about 8,000 more men of the hoplite class. After the Persian Wars, Athens ruled the sea as head of an alliance, the Delian League, of Greek cities against what remained of Persian rule over Greeks in Asia Minor. Athenian sea power brought commercial ascendancy, and the Delian League became an empire of island and coastal cities. Although Athens referred to these cities as her allies, Thucydides considered them to be virtually enslaved by Athens, and this was the view of the Peloponnesians. In fact, Athens shared interests with the democratic elements in many of the cities touched by its influence, while the Spartans found most in common with oligarchical regimes. Was the Athenian Empire truly oppressive? On the positive side, Athens kept the Aegean Sea safe for its island allies by stamping out piracy and keeping the Persians at bay. It also frequently defended the democratic elements of its allies against oligarchic takeovers. On the negative side, if any of the allies turned away from Athens or ceased making payments, Athens would put them down brutally. Thucydides tells us that the empire was unpopular, but gives a hint that it was not unpopular with the democrats of the subject cities. He also supplies evidence that the empire was more popular with its subjects than the Peloponnesians expected. Athens had been exploiting dissensions in the cities it dealt with for a long time, probably siding with democrats against oligarchs, and in this way cultivated the loyalty of at least one faction in many of the cities that came into the empire. When a Spartan general reached the member cities of northern Greece in 424, he was surprised to see how little enthusiasm there was for the freedom he claimed to have brought them. When the Sicilians offered safety to troops from the empire in 413, only a few chose to leave the Athenians to face defeat alone. And when a number of allies rebelled in the moment of Athens' greatest weakness after the Sicilian disaster, a surprising number remained loyal to Athens. All of these incidents took place after Athens had required higher payments to support the war, so it is likely that the Athenians were even more popular with their empire at the onset of the hostilities. Thucydides is not deliberately trying to deceive us, however. The empire had never been popular with the rich and well-born of the subject cities, and these were the people who mattered most to him. End quote. Okay, so there you have a pretty good overview of this. You have Sparta and Athens at war with one another, and he starts right off with some differences between the two. He lists 4 important differences. The first is that Sparta has an ancient constitution, and Athens has been through a century of political upheavals. Its democracy is new, its constitution is new, it's continually in flux. The Spartans are ancient, have an ancient constitution, and they have stability. Its stability, he says, was the envy of Greece. And he says that the constitution of which they were so proud combined elements of monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy. So it was a mixed constitution that dealt a little bit with, and I'm really a fan of that, the monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy balanced against one another, a sort of balance of powers, checks and balances, and it's created stability, whereas Athens keeps jumping back and forth from this to that, and once it goes to democracy, it tries to go all in on democracy, rather than kind of achieving a state of balance that can be long-lasting and stable like the Spartans have. The Spartans are a bastion of resistance to cultural change, and Athens welcomes all sorts of innovations. There are ethnic differences. Sparta controls its own land that is providing food for it. It's more of a land-based power, although they do, have some navy as well, but they're largely land-based. Athens doesn't have access to farmland or to forests, and everything that's coming into Athens to feed its population and everything else is all coming through the port of Athens. Athens is very dependent on its access to the ocean. Sparta is relatively poor, and Athens is relatively rich. Sparta is not extracting any resources from its allies. All of Sparta's alliances are voluntary, and Athens' alliances are not voluntary. Athens is more like leading an empire. He says Spartan government was admired by conservatives all over the Greek world, including Plato. He describes a little bit about the Spartan constitution, the arrangement of the government with kings, well-born citizens, elections, sort of varying degrees of participation in the government, which I think is, I personally, I'm a fan of that sort of thing. I think it works well, and I think it's demonstrated here to have stability, whereas the constant conflicts between the oligarchs and the democrats, that's a characteristic of Athens and the places that Athens interacts with. Athens is all about the democracy, all about the freedoms. Athens is much more like the liberal Democrats, and Sparta is more about the conservative oligarchs. That's kind of the framework. So that when they're dealing with other cities, Athens tends to ally with the Democrats, and the Spartans tend to ally with the oligarchs in any given city. And so there's a lot of conflict in the various cities between these different factions. And what is interesting is that as this war spreads across the Greek world, it is not entirely just an issue of Athens against Sparta. It's a conflict between the Democrats and the oligarchs. Now that's how it's presented. That's how it's translated. You might say that's not the right terminology because Aristotle talked about aristocracy and oligarchy. And if you want to consider both of them in their best lights, you might say this is a conflict between aristocracy and democracy. A well-run aristocracy against well-run democracy. Theoretically, it's biased, I think, to say this is a democracy against oligarchy, with the presumption that oligarchy is a poorly run, ruled by the few. So there you have the basic participants. Now I'm going to jump ahead quite a bit to a point where the situation is this: there's an allied place called Mytilene, and they don't think that it's their alliance with Athens is benefiting them, and they want to be independent and not be involved one way or the other. The Mytileneans rebelled against Athens and ultimately needed the assistance of the Peloponnesian League, and so they joined the enemies of Athens. But the Peloponnesian League couldn't really help them. Unfortunately, they didn't have the naval power to do much for them. So ultimately, they wound up losing to the Athenians and surrendering to the Athenians. The Athenians are trying to determine what the punishment is going to be for rebelling against them. And they decide that all of the men of the place would be killed and all of the women would be taken as slaves. Women and children taken as slaves. And so they sent a ship to Mytilene to carry out this penalty. And then they reconsider the next day. They start to have second thoughts. They reconvene. Is that really what we wanted to do? So I want to read a couple of speeches from this part. 2 speeches. One speech from Cleon and one speech from Diodotus. And Cleon is in favor of maintaining the decision that they already made to carry out the executions, basically kill off the entire city and take the women, children, slaves, totally destroy the city of Mytilene. Diodotus says that's maybe not the best course of action. And they talk a little bit about democracy, the ups and downs of democracy. Cleon is more of a critic of democracy. Although he lives in Athens, he's more of a leaning less toward all the benefits of democracy than Diodotus is. And he has more criticisms of the way Athens is run. So, in its entirety, the speech of Cleon goes as follows. He says, quote, "For my part, I have often seen that a democracy is not capable of ruling an empire. And I see it most clearly now in your change of heart concerning the Mytileneans, because you are not afraid of conspiracies among yourselves in the daily life. You imagine that you can be the same with your allies. And so it does not occur to you that when you let them persuade you to make a mistake, or you relent out of compassion, your softness puts you in danger. It does not win you the affection of your allies, and you do not see that your empire is a tyranny, and that you have unwilling subjects who are continually plotting against you. They obey you not because of any good turns you might do them to your own detriment, and not because of any good will they might have, but only because you exceed them in strength. But it will be the worst mischief of all, if none of our decisions stand firm, and if we never realize that a city with inferior laws is better if they are never relaxed than a city with good laws that have no force. That people are more use if they are sensible without education than if they are clever without self-control. And that the more common sort of people generally govern a city better than those who are more intelligent. For those intellectuals love to appear wiser than the laws, and to win a victory in every public debate, as if there were no more important ways for them to show their wisdom. And that sort of thing usually leads to disaster for the city. But the other sort of people, who mistrust their own wits, are content to admit that they know less than the laws, and they cannot criticize a speech as powerfully as a fine orator can, and so, as impartial judges rather than contestants, they govern a city for the most part very well. We should do the same, therefore, and not be carried away by cleverness and contests of wit, or give to you, the people, advice that runs against our own judgment. As for me, I have the same opinion I had before, and I am amazed at these men, who have brought this matter of the Mytileneans into question again, thus causing a delay that works more to the advantage of those who have committed injustice. After a delay, you see, the victim comes at the wrongdoer with his anger dulled, but the punishment he gives right after an injury is the biggest and most appropriate. I am also amazed that there is anyone to oppose me, anyone who will try to prove that the injustice the Mytileans have committed is good for us, and that what goes wrong for us is really damaging to our allies. Clearly, he must have great trust in his eloquence if he is trying to make you believe that you did not decree what you decreed. Either that or he has been bribed to try to lead you astray with a fine-sounding and elaborate speech. Now, the city gives prizes to others in contests of eloquence like this one, but the risks she must carry herself. You are to blame for staging these rhetorical contests so badly, the habits you've formed, while you merely look on at discussions, and real action is only a story to you. You consider proposals for the future on the basis of fine speeches, as if what they propose were actually possible. And as for action in the past, you think that what has been done in front of your own eyes is less certain than what you have heard in the speeches of clever fault-finders. You are excellent men, at least for being deceived by novelties of rhetoric, and for never wanting to follow advice that is tried and proved. You bow down like slaves to anything unusual, but look with suspicion on anything ordinary. Each of you wishes chiefly to be an effective speaker, but if not, then you enter into competition with those who are. You don't want to be thought slow in following their meaning, so you applaud a sharp point before it is even made. And you are as eager to anticipate what will be said as you are slow to foresee its consequences. You seek to hear about almost anything outside the experience of our daily lives, yet you do not adequately understand what is right before your eyes. To speak plainly, you are so overcome with the delight of the ear that you are more like an audience for the sophists than an assembly deliberating for the good of the city. To put you out of these habits, I tell you that the Mytileans have done us a far greater injustice than any single city. For my part, I can forgive those cities that rebelled because they could not bear being ruled by us, or because they were compelled to do so by the enemy. But these people were islanders. Their city was walled, and they had no fear of our enemies, except by sea, where they were adequately protected by their fleet of triremes. Besides, they were governed by their own laws, and were held by us in the highest honor. That they should have done this. What is it but a conspiracy or a betrayal? It is not a rebellion, for a rebellion can only come from people who have been violently oppressed, whereas these people have joined our bitterest enemies to destroy us. This is far worse than if they had made war on us to increase their own power. They learned nothing from the example of their neighbors' calamities. Everyone who has rebelled against us so far has been put down, and their prosperity did not make them at all cautious before rushing into danger. They were bold in the face of the future, and they had hopes above their power to achieve, though below what they desired. And so they started this war, resolved to put strength before justice. For as soon as they thought they could win, they attacked us, who had done them no injustice. It is usual for cities to turn insolent when they have suddenly come to great and unexpected prosperity. In general, good fortune is more secure in human hands when it comes in reasonable measure than when it arrives unexpectedly, and generally it is easier to keep misfortune away than to preserve great happiness. Long ago, we should have given the Mytileans no more privileges than our other allies, then they would not have come to this degree of insolence. For generally it is human nature to look with contempt on those who serve your interests, and to admire those who never give in to you. They should be punished right now, therefore, as they deserve for their injustice. And do not put all the blame on the oligarchs and absolve the common people, for they all alike took up arms against you. The Democrats could have come over to our side and would long since have recovered their city, but they thought it safer to join in the oligarchs' rebellion. Now consider your allies. If you inflict the same punishment on those who rebel under compulsion by the enemy as on those who rebel of their own accord, don't you think anyone would seize the slightest pretext to rebel, when if they succeed they win their liberty, but if they fail they will suffer nothing that can't be mended? And then we would have to risk our lives and money against one city after another. If we succeed, we recover only a ruined city, and so lose its future revenue, on which our strength is based. But if we fail, we add these as new enemies to those we had before. And the time we need to spend fighting our old enemies, we must use up fighting our own allies. We must not, therefore, give our allies any hope that pardon may be secured by bribery or by persuading us that it is only human to err. For these people conspired against us in full knowledge and did us an injury of their own will, while only involuntary wrongs may be pardoned. Therefore I contend then and now that you ought not to alter your former decision, and you ought not to make the mistake of giving in to the three things that are most damaging to an empire: pity, delight in speeches, and a sense of fairness. It may be right to show pity to those who are like-minded, but not to those who will never have pity on us, and who must necessarily be our enemies forever after. As for the rhetoricians who delight you with their speeches, let them play for their prizes on matters of less weight, and not on a subject that will make the city pay a heavy price for a light pleasure, while the speakers themselves will be well rewarded for speaking well. And as for fairness, we should show that only towards people who will be our friends in the future, not toward those who will still be as they are now if we let them live, our enemies. In sum, I say only this: if you follow my advice, you will do justice to the Mytileneans and promote your own interests at the same time. But if you see the matter differently, you will not win their favor. Instead, you will be condemning yourselves. If they were right to rebel, you ought not to have been their rulers. But then suppose your empire is not justified. If you resolve to hold it anyway, then you must give these people an unreasonable punishment for the benefit of the empire, or else stop having an empire, so that you can give charity without taking any risks. If you keep in mind what it would have been reasonable for them to do to you if they had prevailed, then you, the intended victims, cannot turn out to be less responsive to perceived wrong than those who hatched the plot, and you must think they deserve the same punishment they'd have given you, especially since they were the first to commit an injustice. Those who wrong someone without any excuse are the ones who press him the hardest, even to the death, when they see how dangerous an enemy he will be if he survives. For they will think if one side is wronged without cause and escapes, he will be more harsh than if two sides had hated each other equally in the beginning. Therefore, do not be traitors to yourselves. Recall as vividly as you can what they did to you, and how it was more important than anything else for you to defeat them then. Pay them back now, and do not be softened at the sight of their present condition, or forget how terrible a danger hung over us at that time. Give these people the punishment they deserve, and set up a clear example for our other allies, to show that the penalty for rebellion is death. Once you know this, you will less often have occasion to neglect your enemies and fight against your own allies." End quote. So there he's saying pretty clearly that these guys rebelled against us without cause. If they're not punished, other cities will think that they're not going to be punished if they rebel. It'd be one thing if they had been somehow compelled, forced, or if they had been mistreated in some way, but he says basically, here you are, you have an empire, and if you're going to keep it, you have to do what is necessary to fight for it. And if we're going to keep our allies, if we're going to maintain the strength that we need to defeat Sparta, we can't go just allowing our allies to turn against us for no reason but their own benefit when they think they see an opportunity. Basically saying you have to think about power and victory and not concern yourself with sympathy. He says there's three things that will bring an empire down: pity, delight in speeches, and a concern for fairness. He says you shouldn't be dealing with fairness when you're dealing with your enemies. You're after victory in dealing with your enemies. Your fairness is only reserved for your friends. And these people are not friends since they rebelled against them without cause. So that's his argument. Kind of hard. And he's also not the best fan of democracy. And he teases or he criticizes the people who are listening to him. He says, you guys make all your decisions based on fancy speeches. Who gives the best speech? If someone else comes along and gives a fancier speech than I, with more rhetorical flourish than me, then you'll go do what that person does without taking the thought of considering what is best for the city. You're just swayed this way and that way by speeches. He says, let these speech givers go off and give speeches in the philosophy contests where they can get their prizes. But here in the assembly, where we're dealing with real important issues, let's not just give in to whoever gives the fanciest speech. And that's a sort of criticism of democracy, in a way, criticism that anybody who gets up there and makes a speech can make a speech, and there's no restrictions, there's no securing authority in the hands of the less fickle. But Diodotus, I think that's how you say it, Diodotus, he makes a speech in favor of changing their mind and going back and undoing this call for death of all of the members of the city. But he also has some criticisms of democracy of his own. He says, quote, "I find no fault with those who have brought the Mytilenean business forward for another debate, and I have no praise for those who object to our having frequent discussions on matters of great importance. In my opinion, nothing is more contrary to good judgment than those two, haste and anger. Of these, the one is usually thoughtless, while the other is ill-informed and narrow-minded. And anyone who contends that discussion is not instructive for action is either stupid or defending some private interest of his own. He is stupid if he thinks there is anything other than words that we can use to consider what lies hidden from sight in the future. And he has a private interest if he wants to persuade you to do something awful, but knows that a good speech will not carry a bad cause, so tries to browbeat his opponents and audience with some good slander instead. The most difficult opponents are those who also accuse one of putting on a rhetorical show for a bribe. If the accusation were merely of ignorance, a speaker could lose his case and still go home with a reputation more for stupidity than injustice, but once corruption is imputed to him, then he will be under suspicion even if he wins, and if he loses he will be thought both stupid and unjust. Such accusations do not do the city any good, since it loses good advisers from fear of them. The city would do best if this kind of citizen had the least ability as speakers, for they would then persuade the city to fewer errors. A good citizen should not go about terrifying those who speak against him, but he should try to look better in a fair debate. A sensible city should neither add to nor reduce the honor in which it holds its best advisers, nor should it punish or even dishonor those whose advice it does not take. This would make it less attractive for a successful speaker to seek greater popularity by speaking against his better judgment, or for an unsuccessful one to try to strive in this way to gratify the people and gain a majority. But if we do the opposite of that here, and besides, if anyone is suspected of corruption but gives the best advice anyway, we are so resentful of the profit we think he is making, though this is uncertain, that we give up benefits the city would certainly have received. It has become the rule, also, to treat good advice honestly given as being no less under suspicion than bad, so that a man who has something rather good to say must tell lies in order to be believed, just as a man who gives terrible advice must win over the people by deception. Because of these suspicions, ours is the only city that no one can possibly benefit openly without deception, since if anyone does good openly to the city, his reward will be the suspicion that he had something secretly to gain from this. But on the most important matters, such as these, we orators must decide to show more foresight than is found in you short-sighted citizens, especially since we stand accountable for the advice we give. But you listeners are not accountable to anyone, because if you were subject to the same penalties as the advisers you follow, you would make more sensible decisions. As it is, whenever you fail, you give in to your momentary anger and punish the man who persuaded you for his one error of judgment, instead of punishing yourselves for the many mistakes in which you had a part. For my part, I did not come forward to speak about Mytilene with any purpose to contradict or to accuse. Our dispute, if we are sensible, will concern not their injustice to us, but our judgment as to what is best for us. Even if I prove them guilty of terrible injustice, I still would not advise the death penalty for this unless that was to our advantage. Even if they deserve to be pardoned, I would not have you pardon them, if it did not turn out to be good for the city. In my opinion, what we are discussing concerns the future more than the present, and as for this point that Cleon insists on, that the death penalty will be to our advantage in the future by keeping the others from rebelling, I maintain exactly the opposite view, and I too am looking at our future well-being. I urge you not to reject the usefulness of my advice in favor of the apparent attractions of his. In view of your present anger against the Mytileneans, you may agree that his argument is more in accord with justice, but we are not at law with them, and so we have no need to speak of justice. We are in council instead, and must decide how the Mytileneans can be put to the best use for us. The death penalty has been ordained for many offenses in various cities, and these are minor offenses compared to this one. Yet people still risk their lives when they are buoyed up by hope, and no one has ever gone into a dangerous conspiracy convinced that he would not succeed. What city would ever attempt a rebellion on the supposition that her resources, whether from home or from alliance with other states, are too weak for this? They all have it by nature to do wrong, both men and cities, and there is no law that will prevent it. People have gone through all possible penalties, adding to them, in the hope that fewer crimes will then be done to them by evildoers. It stands to reason that there were milder punishments in the old days, even for the most heinous crimes, but as the laws continued to be violated, in time most cities arrived at the death penalty, and still the laws are violated. Either some greater terror than death must be found, therefore, or else punishment will not deter crime. Poverty compels the poor to be daring, while the powerful are led by pride and arrogance into taking more than their share. Each human condition is dominated by some great and incurable passion that impels people to danger. Hope and passionate desire, however, dominate every situation, with desire as the leader and hope as the companion. Desire thinking out a plan, and hope promising a wealth of good fortune. These two cause the greatest mischief, and because they are invisible, they are more dangerous than the evils we see. Besides these, fortune plays no less a part in leading men on, since she can present herself unexpectedly and excite you to take a risk, even with inadequate resources. This happens especially to cities because of the serious issues at stake, their own freedom and their empire over others, and because an individual who is acting with everyone else has an unreasonably high estimate of his own ability. In a word, it is an impossible thing. You would have to be simple-minded to believe that people can be deterred by force of law or by anything else that is frightening from doing what human nature is earnestly bent on doing. We should not, therefore, make a bad decision, relying on capital punishment to protect us, or set such hopeless conditions that our rebels have no opportunity to repent and atone for their crimes as quickly as possible. Consider this. If a city in rebellion knew it could not hold out, as things are, it would come to terms while it could still pay our expenses and make its remaining contributions. But if we take Cleon's way, wouldn't any city prepare better for a rebellion than they do now, and hold out in a siege to the very last, since it would mean the same whether they gave in late or early? And what is this if not harmful to us? To have the expense of a siege because they will not come to terms, and then, when we have taken a city, to find it ruined and to lose its revenue for the future. You see, our strength against our enemies depends on that revenue. We should not then be strict judges in punishing offenders, and so harm ourselves. Instead, we should look for a way to impose moderate penalties to ensure that we will in the future be able to make use of cities that can make us substantial payments. We should not plan to keep them in check by the rigor of laws, but by watching their actions closely. We are doing the opposite now if we think we should punish cruelly a city that used to be free, was held in our empire by force, rebelled against us for a good reason to restore its autonomy, and now has been defeated. What we ought to do in the case of a city of free men is not to impose extreme penalties after they rebel, but to be extremely watchful before they rebel, and to take care that the idea of rebellion never crosses their minds. And once we have overcome them, we should lay the fault upon as few of them as we can. Consider also how great a mistake you will be making on this score if you follow Cleon's advice. As things are, the Democrats in all the cities are your friends, and either they do not join the oligarchs in rebellion, or if they are forced to, they remain hostile to the rebels, so that when you go to war with them, you have their common people on your side. But if you destroy the Democrats of Mytilene, who had no part in the rebellion, and who delivered the city into your hands of their own will as soon as they were armed, then you will first commit an injustice by killing those who have done you good service, And second, accomplish exactly what oligarchs everywhere want the most. When they have made a city rebel, they will immediately have the Democrats on their side because you will have shown them in advance that those who are not guilty of injustice suffer the same penalty as those who are. And even if they were guilty, however, we should pretend that they were not, so that the only party still allied with us will not become our enemy. And in order to keep our empire intact, I think it much more advantageous for us to put up with an injustice willingly than for us justly to destroy people we ought not to destroy. And as for Cleon's idea that justice and our own advantage come to the same in the case of punishment, these two cannot be found to coincide in the present case. Now I want you to accept my proposal because you see that it is the best course, and not because you are swayed more by pity or a sense of fairness. I would not have you influenced by those factors any more than Cleon would, but take my advice and judge the leaders of the rebellion at your leisure, while you let the rest enjoy their city. That will be good for the future, and it will strike fear into your enemies today. Those who plan well against their enemies, you see, are more formidable than those who attack with active force and foolishness combined. End quote. So here you get Diodotus basically arguing that we shouldn't be concerned with justice, whether it's just to kill them or not, but we should be concerned with our future, and it's not to our benefit to kill everybody in the city for several reasons. Other cities, if they find themselves in rebellion, will not believe that there's any way out, there's any except for surrender, and so they'll dig in all the harder, and they'll destroy the city. If you take it, they'll fight to the very last breath, because they know that they'll get no mercy. A city that understands that there will be some sort of mercy for them, for the common people of the city, if they give up their rebellion, will be more inclined to negotiate, because they think that maybe the leaders of the rebellion won't get away with it. They'll be punished, but the common people of the city will have some sort of clemency, and so they'll be convinced to work along with Athens, especially if all these cities have their own oligarchs and democrats factions within them. If they kill the Democrats of Mytilene, then the other Democrats elsewhere are not going to want to maintain an alliance with Athens, or if the oligarchs rebel, then the Democrats will more enthusiastically join because they don't want to get punished by Athens. So he's talking about thinking about strategically, not just trying to be as harsh as possible in order to deter rebellion, not thinking about how they can punish people, but how they can maintain the alliances that they desperately need to maintain in order to see their way through this war. Not to be persuaded by a sense of justice that, oh, these people deserve to be punished, but more Machiavellian, even in the sense that, not just the sense that one has to be cruel to be Machiavellian, but also that one has to offer clemency at the right moment to the right people in order to be truly Machiavellian, to understand who your allies are, and to have allies, to foster allies when you need allies, and do what is necessary to maintain those alliances. I also think it's interesting when Diodotus talks about how all of the people who give the speeches and make the persuasive arguments one way or the other, those are the people who wind up getting punished if their advice leads to negative outcomes. But all of the people who vote in favor of the course of events that leads to the negative outcome, those people are just as guilty of contributing to the negative event, but they never have. No one's ever punished for voting the wrong way. It's all of the speakers who are punished. So the speakers have to think more carefully and be more cautious, whereas the voters just do whatever. And that's an interesting way of thinking about democracy also, that, especially when someone voting for a course of action can't be held accountable, or doesn't particularly suffer themselves, perhaps, on account of the bad strategy. Or people are given, there's plenty of criticism of democracy, that people are given the opportunity to make decisions on things that they just don't really know about. They're not informed about. Thucydides is not a fan of democracy. he tends to be more on the side of the oligarchs. He's very fond of Sparta, and the Spartan generals and the Spartan decisions are all treated as if they are wise, stable, and generally positive and beneficial. And the Athenians don't come off all that great in Thucydides. It really becomes clear that although he's not super explicit about it, his sympathy lies more with Sparta than with Athens. And ultimately, Sparta won the war. But he's critical of Athens, and he displays the criticism. He illustrates the criticism that they're not able to make up their mind. They want to do one thing, and the very next day they reconvene the assembly to change their mind. And ultimately, they did change their mind, sent another ship to go save the lives of these people, and didn't wind up killing them all. So that's the sort of way that Thucydides will illustrate two different arguments, put arguments in the mouths of two different people, have them arguing against one another, each one sort of presenting the best version of their case, of their side of the argument. One more section I want to read is not a speech, but is when Thucydides is narrating the events of the civil war in Corcyra. And this is pretty interesting. He says, quote, "When the people of Corcyra heard that the Athenian ships were approaching, and that the Peloponnesians were leaving, they brought in the Messenian soldiers who had been outside into the city, and ordered the ships they had manned to come round into the Helaic port. The Messenians here were former helots of the Spartans, who had been resettled by Athens near Corcyra after the failure of their revolt against Sparta in 464. They had been brought to Corcyra by the Athenians to support the Democrats there. While they were going around, the Corcyrian Democrats killed all the opposing faction they could lay hands on. And as for the ones they had persuaded to man the ships, they killed them all as they disembarked. And they came to the temple of Hera, and persuaded 50 of the oligarchic sympathizers who had taken sanctuary there to submit themselves to a trial. Then they condemned them all to death. When they saw what was being done, most of the suppliants, all those who were not induced to stand trial by law, killed one another right there in the temple. Some hanged themselves on trees, and everyone made away with himself by what means he could. For the 7 days that the Athenian admiral Eurymedon stayed there with his 60 ships, the Corcyrians went on killing as many of their own people as they took to be their enemies. They accused them of subverting the democracy. But some of the victims were killed on account of private hatred, and some by their debtors, for the money they had lent them. Every form of death was seen at this time, and, as tends to happen in such cases, there was nothing people would not do, and more. Fathers killed their sons, men were dragged out of the temples and then killed hard by, and some who were walled up in the temple of Dionysus died inside it. So cruel was the course of this civil war, and it seemed all the more so because it was among the first of these. Afterwards, virtually all Greece was in upheaval, and quarrels arose everywhere between the democratic leaders, who sought to bring in the Athenians, and the oligarchs, who wanted to bring in the Lacedaemonians. Now in time of peace, they could have had no pretext, and would not have been so eager to call them in. But because it was war, and allies were to be had for either party to hurt their enemies and strengthen themselves at the same time, invitations to intervene came readily from those who wanted a new government. Civil war brought many hardships to the cities, such as happen and will always happen as long as human nature is the same, although they may be more or less violent or take different forms depending on the circumstances in each case. In peace and prosperity, cities and private individuals alike are better minded because they are not plunged into the necessity of doing anything against their will. But war is a violent teacher. It gives most people impulses that are as bad as their situation when it takes away the easy supply of what they need for daily life. Civil war ran through the cities. Those it struck later heard what the first cities had done and far exceeded them in inventing artful means for attack and bizarre forms of revenge. And they reversed the usual way of using words to evaluate activities. Ill-considered boldness was counted as loyal manliness. Prudent hesitation was held to be cowardice in disguise, and moderation merely the cloak of an unmanly nature. A mind that could grasp the good of the whole was considered wholly lazy. Sudden fury was accepted as part of manly valor, while plotting for one's own security was thought a reasonable excuse for delaying action. A man who started a quarrel was always to be trusted, while one who opposed him was under suspicion. A man who made a plot was intelligent if it happened to succeed, while one who could smell out a plot was deemed even more clever. Anyone who took precautions, however, so as not to need to do either one, had been frightened by the other side, they would say, into subverting his own political party. In brief, a man was praised if he could commit some evil action before anyone else did, or if he could cheer on another person who had never meant to do such a thing. Family ties were not so close as those of the political parties, because their members would readily dare to do anything on the slightest pretext. These parties, you see, were not formed under existing laws for the good, but for avarice in violation of established law. And the oaths they swore to each other had their authority not so much by divine law as by their being partners in breaking the law. And if their opponents gave a good speech, if they were the stronger party, they did not receive it in a generous spirit, but with an eye to prevent its taking effect. To take revenge was of higher value than never to have received injury. And as for oaths of reconciliation, when there were any, these were offered for the moment when both sides were at an impasse, and were in force only while neither side had help from abroad. But on the first opportunity, when one person saw the other unguarded and dared to act, he found his revenge sweeter because he had broken trust than if he had acted openly. He had taken the safer course, and he gave himself the prize for intelligence if he had triumphed by fraud. Evildoers are called skillful sooner than simpletons are called good, and people are ashamed to be called simpletons, but take pride in being thought skillful. The cause for all this was the desire to rule out of avarice and ambition, and the zeal for winning that proceeds from those two. Those who led their parties in the cities promoted their policies under decent-sounding names, equality for ordinary citizens on one side and moderate aristocracy on the other. And though they pretended to serve the public in their speeches, they actually treated it as the prize for their competition. And striving by whatever means to win, both sides ventured on most horrible outrages and exacted even greater revenge, without any regard for justice or the public good. Each party was limited only by its own appetite at the time, and stood ready to satisfy its ambition of the moment, either by voting for an unjust verdict or seizing control by force. So neither side thought much of piety, but they praised those who could pass a horrible measure under the cover of a fine speech. The citizens who remained in the middle were destroyed by both parties, partly because they would not side with them, and partly for envy that they might escape in this way. Thus was every kind of wickedness afoot throughout all Greece by the occasion of civil wars. Simplicity, which is the chief cause of a generous spirit, was laughed down and disappeared. Citizens were sharply divided into opposing camps, and without trust, their thoughts were in battle array. No speech was so powerful, no oath so terrible, as to overcome this mutual hostility. The more they reckoned up their chances, the less hope they had for a firm peace. So they were all looking to avoid harm from each other, and were unable to rely on trust. For the most part, those with the weakest minds had the greatest success, since a sense of their own inferiority and the subtlety of their opponents put them into great fear that they would be overcome in debate or by schemes due to their enemies' intelligence. They therefore went immediately to work against them in action, while their more intelligent opponents, scornful and confident that they could foresee any attack, thought they had no need to take by force what might be gotten by wit. They were therefore unprotected, and so more easily killed. End quote. He goes on a little bit more to talk about some of the particular details of how it all turns out. The Athenian navy has arrived, and so the Democrats are all taking their vengeance on the oligarchs of Corcyra. And he says that this was one of the first civil wars, but it spread across all of Greece. And as soon as the cities who had been in a sort of comfortable split between the Democrats and the oligarchs some sort of understanding. As soon as they saw that there was the possibility of calling in outside assistance to gain an upper hand, every faction considered that they should do that, and they also considered that their opponents might do that. And there was this same sort of anticipation that we talked about in that episode a few episodes ago when we talked about Hobbes. The anticipation that the other side would betray their fellow citizens and call in outside aid to gain the upper hand. Each side felt they had to be the ones to act first. And so, like I said, this was not just Athens and Sparta. This was oligarchs and Democrats across the whole Greek world. And in Corcyra, the Democrats wound up killing off essentially all of the oligarchs. The oligarchs built a fort, but then they took the fort, destroyed it, and all the oligarchs were basically killed off. It's pretty wild. He talks about all of the breakdown of what the common language, the way, the trust between people, the things people valued. Suddenly, during Civil War, everyone was valuing their ability to basically get one over on their enemy, to be crafty, to strike first. It's also interesting that he says the simple-minded really benefited because they were intimidated by their scheming opponents' higher intelligence. And so they thought, I can't wait around and let my enemies' schemes come to fruition. And so they would act and kill their enemies before the intelligent folks who trusted in their complicated schemes were caught unawares when the blade was at their throat. So that's pretty wild. All of the sense of decency in the civil conflict, the sense of trust and the sense of decency vanishes once one side or the other sees the opportunity to finally gain the upper hand once and for all. So that's kind of tragic, really. This whole chapter is called Human Nature Laid Bare in Civil War. And human nature presented in that way, seeming as though the worst aspects of people's behavior when they're faced with a Hobbesian state of nature, a Hobbesian war of all against all, the betrayals that occur, the putting the political parties ahead of family ties, fathers killing their sons, the whole 9 yards, seems as though that's presented as human nature, revealed in a state of war. I'm not so sure that is accurately called the raw human nature, but in a state of distrust and conflict between people, maybe it is that our true nature comes out, or maybe it's just that another aspect of our nature, that aspect of our nature that is suited to the moment. Because it is the case that some people survived and some people didn't survive, and the ones who survived were the ones who were successful. And maybe it was their duplicity, and maybe it was their willingness to strike first. Maybe it was their capacity to scheme, their capacity to betray that brought them to survival on the other side of the civil wars and pass their scheming traits on to the next generation. Maybe that is a part of human nature, but it's also, I don't think, the entirety of human nature that's revealed in those sort of situations. So I'm going to leave it at that. Thank you so much for listening. I'll talk to you again next time. Goodbye.